It is time for my annual NFL quarterbacks as NBA player comps. It's not perfect. I spend some time on this every year. I'm watching games. I'm like, who's this guy like? What could we make? What kind of connection could we make that's like a comparable conversation? Because it's not just this guy looks like this guy's numbers are like this guy's playoff success is this, or lack of playoff success is the same. It's more about the conversation with some of that stuff sprinkled in. Okay, so we always had a LeBron James Brady one. But Brady's gone, and there is no LeBron James. Again, what LeBron is doing, I'm not sure we're ever going to be able to compare anything to it. Jason Peters doesn't seem like a good fit, plays offensive line. He's 41. Matt Prater feels a little dismissive to compare to LeBron James. So let's just say this. There is no LeBron James NFL comp. So if we go back to the quarterback part of it, and again, Rodgers, I'm going to save him for later, and he missed the season. So if we start at the top, Mahomes, it is Jokic. Both currently the best players in their sport. They always feel like they're giving their offense a chance to have a good look, no matter what the circumstances, despite the last fourth quarter possessions for the Chiefs that have not worked out this season. But it still feels like you're still scared. Like, is Mahomes still going to find a way to convert a 4th and 20 that I really wouldn't have faith in any other player in the league? And there's a lot of stuff with Jokic. It's like, okay, well, the defense is going to do this. Defense is going to do that. It's like, yeah, okay, you can try a bunch of those things. But over the course of a game, I think he's going to figure you out. They elevate everyone around them unless it's Kadarius Toney or Bones Highland. They both have one guy. They're like, I can't work with this. All right, Lamar Embiid. I've touched on this in the past. Let's hammer it right now. Both have an MVP. Both have absurd numbers. Lamar, although not statistically up at the top with some of the other quarterbacks and stuff when you're looking at total touchdowns, everything, but he is projecting now to be the first ever quarterback who throws for over 3,700 yards and rushes for over 900 yards. No one else has ever done that before. Embiid, on the other hand, is averaging 34 a game right now. And I mean, dude, he could have even more points if they want to play him more in the fourth quarter of some of these blowouts in December. That's 15th all time if he stayed at 34. The last center to score 34 points a game was Kareem in 71 and 72. But the playoff numbers and the playoff hesitation is real, and it's there for both of them. I think even more so with Lamar than it is for Embiid. We've covered Lamar's drop-off in the postseason, but it's less games. That sample is really, really small. And, you know, when you actually look at the touchdown passes, it's in the beginning of his playoff career where he's against the Chargers, where I thought at that point he was still a very limited quarterback. Where Embiid, the traditional numbers in the playoffs are still pretty good, 24, 11, and 3. But the metrics for Embiid, like, I was surprised how much of a drop-off there's been from the regular season to the playoffs. PER, it goes from 28 to 21.6. Win shares per 48. You're like, hey, what's up with this nerdy stuff? The point is like, whenever you're over 2 in that, a 0.2 in the win shares per 48, you're a tremendous player. It drops down to like 0.134. Again, that's just to point out how big of a gap that is, because that's a significant gap there. All right, let's keep it rolling. Josh Allen is Luka Doncic. Huge white guy stuff, rather visual. Physically, not much you can do with either of them. So when does it get interesting? Now, because if either were to win a title, there would be momentum. There would be a public push, whether it were fans or the media, to hand over the belt to a Luka or a Josh Allen. If Luka to win a title, the conversation is going to be that next morning, every show is asking, is Luka the best player in the world? And a lot of people would say yes. And that's just kind of what happens. I don't like, it took me a while to give it from Durant to Giannis. I don't like that Jokic immediately got it from Giannis, but it just feels right. That's exactly what would happen with Luka. And you may think, well, wait, would that actually happen if Josh Allen were to win a Super Bowl this year? I think it would. I think it would come up. I think that conversation, like, there's one thing to pose the question as content. It's another thing to have people actually believe it. And if you go back to the beginning of last year, there felt like there was a push to find somebody else, ABM, anybody but Mahomes. Whether it was Jimmy Johnson saying, hey, I'd rather have Herbert over Mahomes. And then there's like, maybe Allen actually is the better guy. And then Mahomes goes and takes care of business and wins the Super Bowl. So that's where I think there's a good connection. Tua, Trae Young. Okay, this one feels a bit more like the physical comp. That's not really what it is. We know they both have big numbers. It's not the small thing. There is no version of officiating in the NFL that is comparable to how Trae benefits. But there is something that is very similar, and it is this. As you've watched both play throughout their careers, and Trey has the one playoff run to the Eastern Conference Finals that's beyond what Tua has had, but the Tua thing still feels newer than Trey Young. This is the similarity. This is why I've connected the two. Because I think most of us, when you watched Atlanta with Trey and you go, okay, that Eastern Conference Finals run was kind of fun, but I think for the most part, there feels like there's a bit of a limitation despite his talent and his output. The same can be said for Tua, where when it's against the better teams, it looks different, it feels different. And yet the real similarity is when you bring up that ceiling that I feel is accurate and exists and is obvious to most of us, both fan bases absolutely lose their shit. Aaron Rodgers, I was going to go with Royce White, doesn't play in the league anymore. So let's just say Kyrie Irving. The reason I bring it up beyond the obvious is there's a physics book that I read, and I don't think I talked to you about it a ton because I started to realize, like, hey, once you read books, are you reading them for you or are you reading them so everybody knows that you read them? One of my favorite pieces of content is somebody who is a public figure sharing their reading list. Sometimes it's actually beneficial to be like, hey, I align with this person. If they're into this, I might be into it. I like when people ask me for book recommendations, but I also think there's a very narcissistic thing that happens there where it's like, hey, I read these books, but you better know that I read these books. And there was an interview I saw with Rodgers once where they were like, what are you reading? He was like, oh, this book on physics. I was like, of course. You were psyched. You were pumped to tell us you're reading a book on physics. Let's keep it rolling. Let's go with some young guys. Bryce Young, is there a comp? Number 1 overall pick, disappointing first season. Cade Cunningham, number 1 pick. Now, to be fair to Cade, thank God, if you start looking at the trend of his numbers, and we were making up all sorts of dumb trades, Bill and I, yesterday, knowing full well you don't trade a player like Cade. The franchise would never do that kind of thing this soon into it. And it looks like with some of the stuff that they're trying to do, like Cade is not nearly as bad as he was in the beginning of the year, which gives me a lot of hope. So that's a thing that Bryce doesn't necessarily have. I think the comparison there is that you go, wait, did we get it wrong? Which is part of the Cade question. But at least with Cade, like there was no one else to take. So with Bryce, the fact that it hasn't looked as good, but Cade has been in the league 3 years, is that a perfect one? So what if Bryce is actually Scoot Henderson, where this season is not a final indictment? If at the end of the year you're going, Bryce is never going to be good, that's completely unfair. You look at that offensive line, the coach loses his job halfway through the season. He doesn't have a ton of weapons, but there were still going to be questions about Bryce. But you can't end 23 going, he's not the guy. That's not fair. And the reason I bring that up is because when I saw Scoot in a redraft where he was at the end of the lottery after, I think, 10 career games, I'm like, that feels a little quick. So for both players, and Scoot's been better recently, if both players, like, it'd be nice if it looked a little better, but we can't be saying anything definitive about either player until, end of year 2, you can talk to me. So if we're working with young guys here for the NBA NFL comp deal, is CJ Stroud actually Chet Holmgren? It looks like CJ's clearly going to be better than Bryce. I don't think that's ridiculous to say. Is Chet better than Wembanyama? He's played a more important role. The team is far better. The Spurs have 4 wins. As great as you may have thought Wembanyama was going to be, and I certainly hold out that hope. Look, he's incredible. It's unlike anything we've ever seen before. When it's right, it's awesome. He's still, like, the traditional numbers are really, really good with him. I still think he has a hard time kind of getting into his offense and still makes some decisions that show that he wants to be like a 2 guard or a small forward, to show it at times. So there's just a lot of shots throughout a course of a game. You're like, what the hell was that? Whereas Chet doesn't have as much on him. He has a much better team. The whole thing is more stable. Like, Oklahoma City has a real chance to make some noise here in the playoffs. So that would be, at least for this year, maybe not a career projection, but if I was doing the comp for just this year, I would say, hey, Chet's actually felt like the better story, despite all the attention to the other guy in Wembanyama, which, again, I understand are different draft classes, but both are rookies, where Stroud has clearly been the headliner for the quarterback rookies for this year. Russell Wilson, Kirk Cousins. Doesn't work. Both quarterbacks. Is there a quarterback comp for Ja Morant? There is. Probably not going to do it. How about Justin Fields, Jalen Green? So as the Fields last month has played out, he has 2 picks. I don't count them. They were the 2 picks that were Hail Marys at the end of the first half and at the end of the game this previous week. So he's been pretty clean in the turnover part of it, at least throwing the football. Like I have him down my own personal interception charting that I do. I have him at 0 interceptions this month. But that has led to what I still think is some really absurd conversation about him actually still being in the mix to have this gig. And I understand it. You've spent a top pick on him. You want it to work out. You're starting to play the game of like, hey, if Fields has actually turned the corner, add a receiver here, add another line, like all these different things that you want to do. It's a lot like the Jalen Green part of it. Now, it's not perfect because Fields can't have the job and still be on the Bears if they take somebody else, right? Jalen Green can still be on the Rockets and be one of the 5 guys that are playing. It's more about having the keys to the franchise where there's a pushback from some of the Fields. Maybe it's not even accurate. Maybe I'm just seeing some of the stuff in the media that's playing out where 80% of the fan base is like, dude, you're wrong. We're totally fine moving on from him. But there's still an emotional part of handing it over to somebody else, whereas Green will still be on the team. But it doesn't look like it's going to be his team the way maybe you thought it was when he was drafted and his rookie and his second year when he got all these options. Maybe he gets better. Maybe it's a delay for him in his growth, but it's feeling like, at least in Houston, it is a transition away from him being the primary guy. And it's happening right now, by the way, when you watch the way they run their offense late in games. Is there a Purdy in the NBA? It would be what? It would be big numbers, good team, win games, doubt because of system. 2018-19 Harden. MVPs. Maybe, not perfect. I don't think there's a quarterback comp for Steph Curry right now. There just isn't. It would have to be one of the all-time great resumes, future Hall of Famer, still really good, questions about this team. Don't really think they're going to do anything anymore. It would have to be like a Brady on a team that feels like they have no chance in the playoffs. And I don't think we have that right now. Mac Jones is James Bouknight. The last one that I was trying to find was a Justin Herbert. I thought about Tatum. I'm like, that's ridiculous. Tatum's been to the NBA Finals, another Eastern Conference Finals a bunch of times. Not another one, tons of them. That's not fair to Tatum. Like, even if you think where Herbert gets talked about, like, could he actually be the best quarterback in the league, like at the best versions of the Herbert conversation, and then the reservations about it now, you'd be like, hey, Tatum's awesome. He's really, really good, but I don't know that he's ever really going to be one of those guys. That's not right. Then I started thinking about, is Zion there? I'm like, yeah, that doesn't seem right either. It was maybe the best thing we thought of was a prime Chris Paul, where it's like, hey, I know this guy is really, really good, but it just hasn't worked out. So it's certainly not Chris Paul now, but I don't think there's a perfect NBA comp for Herbert. Let's finish with this, unrelated. Is Ben Affleck movie John Mayer? And is John Mayer music Ben Affleck?